There's a version of the media business where a podcast is just a microphone and a conversation. Then there's the version Seth Rubinroit has spent his entire career building, where one conversation becomes television, becomes YouTube, becomes a clip on your phone at the gym, and fuels an entire revenue engine that keeps growing while the costs stay flat. Today's guests got to start young, really young. Seth and his brother talked their way into NBA Summer League credentials as preteens, reporting for outlets like Sports Illustrated for Kids and Time for Kids, and learning the lesson that shaped everything after. Always know what's in it for the other side of the table. That instinct carried him from a USC business degree and a scrappy basketball website to Universal Sports Network, and then to NBC, where he worked the Rio and Pyongyang Olympics before pitching executives on something they weren't sure they needed: audio. That pitch became one podcast, then two, then more than 30 shows, one of the fastest growing lines in the business. Today, Seth leads audio and digital strategy at NBC Universal, teaches at USC, and thinks daily about where content, technology, and monetization all head next. In this episode, Adam digs into the reach versus revenue math behind a podcast slate, why the smartest shows follow the audience instead of the talent, how AI is quietly reshaping production, and what all of it means for the next generation of storytellers. I'm Bryce Clinton, and this is the Roar Podcast.
Welcome to the Roar Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Grossman. With me today is Seth Rubinroit. Seth, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate the invitation. Excited to be here.
Hey, excited to have you here as well. Thank you for the help with the pronunciation of your name before. So hopefully we just were talking about it. Hopefully we got it right. But it's great to have you on. You and I met at the SBJ Awards, and we're both judges at the SBJ Awards, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's exciting to talk about more what you're doing at NBC, particularly on everything going on with the World Cup, which we'll get into, all the stuff you're doing on the podcast side. But as we like to always say, we like to start from the beginning. So tell us a little bit more about you and how you got to this point in your career.
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. Thanks again for the invitation. So I started doing this really, really young. Do you remember the NBA Summer League before it was in Vegas?
Well, first of all, you really young, as we talked about even in the awards, like really young is not that long ago for you. You're not
No,
a young guy, right?
No, definitely, not that long, but it seems like I've been in the industry a lot longer than, my age would indicate, just because of all the things and how early I started.
Yeah.
So it really kind of goes back to the NBA Summer League, which used to be, if you remember, in Long Beach, well before it moved to Las Vegas. My brother Sam and I would go down there, every year as fans. My parents were nice enough to make the long drive all the way down to Long Beach, which could be really bad in traffic. And, we'd go there as fans and seeing all the NBA players making their professional debuts. And we're having a blast, getting autographs, having the food, watching the games, doing all the things that the kids do. And, kind of just noticed that, hey, look, there's those journalists that are sitting courtside and they get to go for free and they're having the free food and they're getting to talk to the players. What a cool thing to be able to do. So my brother and I would literally just kind of start doing it. We'd go to the local high schools and start doing some reporting and turn those little clips into bigger clips and bigger clips. And eventually we were doing some big publications like Sports Illustrated for Kids and Time Magazine for Kids. And, we're able to go back to the NBA Summer League and be the first credentialed members of the media under 18 to ever do it. And so, just kind of knew we wanted to be in the sports media early and just kind of jumped on it. And it's just kind of, spiraled into where we are today.
First of all, it's incredible. Before we jump into some of the other things you talk about in terms of spiraling, what was it like being a credentialed media member under the age of 18? What was the experience like? How did you interact with some of the other reporters? And what was it like to interview the players when you're that age?
It was a lot of fun. I mean, just talk about differentiation. I mean, the fact that we were 12 years old and, 5'0", interviewing these players that are 7 feet tall and holding up the mic like this. We've got some great pictures of interviewing people like, Andrew Bynum from the Lakers and, seeing after his first game where, just holding the mic straight up and, I think it really kind of just put us on a different level because we didn't try and kind of go there and just kind of do what everybody else was doing and ask the same questions everybody else was asking. We leaned into kind of being younger and being able to relate to the players in a different way and coming up with content that was different than what you would have read in the Los Angeles Times or the Daily News or whatever it was. So we really try to kind of talk to the players differently, still professional, but in a different way, trying to kind of find our lane, see if we could get something out of the players that, someone that was twice their age would be able to get out of them.
And do you remember any of the questions that you used to have, or any one in particular, or a couple in particular that you remember that were more 12-year-old or 13-year-old type questions?
Selfishly at that time when we're, still had some basketball aspirations, trying to figure out, any tips and pointers of how we could kind of make it ourselves. But, that dream pretty quickly fizzled out in high school when we saw the athletic career wasn't going to really take off. But really was just kind of trying to understand who they are as people, what makes them tick, what their goals are as they enter the NBA and all of a sudden they have all this money and they've got this fame and, how it changes. But some of these guys were coming straight from high school and had never really experienced that. And so all of a sudden, they're almost as nervous doing the interview with us as we are asking them questions. So trying to kind of see if we could tell their story in a different way, get to know them and really kind of, peel open that onion so we could get to know them in a fun, different way.
Any stories about the players that you remember that were more about them as people than athletes?
Man, my favorite one of all time is Magic Johnson. We sat down with him and, we went into his office and, Magic Johnson is someone that's become a big businessman, right? A billionaire himself. And we go into this big conference room and his assistant says, hey, you've got 10 minutes with Magic, so make sure you ask your best questions because you got 10 minutes. We start firing questions at Magic and he's like, how do you know that? You weren't even alive when that happened. Like, this is really impressive. And, sure enough, minute 7, 8, 9, the assistant kind of pops their head in and says, wrap it up, Magic. We're almost done. And Magic's like, no. These kids are good. Give them a couple more minutes. And 10 minutes later, the assistant would come back in and Magic would shoo him away. And then, 10 minutes again, it would happen again. And we ended up being in there in the conference room with Magic Johnson for almost an hour, which was just super generous of him to kind of give that much time. And, always just kind of the lesson I always took away from that is going into every interview with high energy, excitement, preparation, showing, why it's worth their time to be able to talk to you. And so that was a great lesson. I'm always indebted for, I was a nobody, back then, for Magic to kind of give that much of his time to, some punk 14, 15-year-old kid.
And one of the things I talk consistently to my students about is exactly what you just said. What's in it for the other side of the conversation? What's in it for that person? If you can ask good questions, if you can show that you've really done research and you can show you've really thought about what you're doing. And also, I think it is really important, like you're saying, bring high energy, being personable. A lot of people are genuinely interested in sports. And if you can convey that interest and that excitement, that's really helpful. So I think that's a really good lesson. Usually we save some more of the lessons as we're going along, but it's a really good one. And I'm glad you mentioned it. So
no, it's so true. And I'm like, I tell my students that too, going back to that NBA Summer League example, the first time we applied for credentials, the answer was no. It was like, why would we credential some, 12-year-old kid? And to your point of, what's in it for them, we had to really sell ourselves. Why would it benefit the NBA Summer League to have us there? And what we did was we said, hey, we found this paper that is distributed to every single high school in the Los Angeles area, right? And it's going to reach tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of students that otherwise might not even know that the NBA Summer League exists. But if they've heard about it and they're like, wow, what a great event to attend, they're going to do the same thing we did and ask their parents to drive them down to Long Beach so that they can go attend in person, buy the tickets, buy the merch, buy the food. So when we presented it like that, like, hey, can you please give me a press credential for the NBA Summer League? More like, hey, we are really going to drive your business and introduce you to the Los Angeles marketplace. Totally changed the game. So, I tell that to my students, like when you're asking for an interview, when you're asking for press credentials, you really got to sell yourself, sell the opportunity. How many people is this going to reach? What's the distribution look like? Why is it worth their time? So, they say everything is sales, and really is.
I think we gave this a little bit of short shrift, but how did you start a newspaper when you're that age that had such relatively large distribution? I mean, that's a lot of people for a 14 or 15-year-old, particularly at that time when it was harder to get that type of distribution on non-social media or non-digital media directly platform. So how were you able to get such a large distribution?
No, it's a great question, Adam, and it would have been so much different if I did it today. Because back then, you're right. Like there was only so many different publications. So, we would go to a small publication and send in an article and, 50-50 shot. Maybe they run it, maybe they don't run it, right? And we were so dependent on the publication to be able to do it because they were really the gatekeepers for getting our content out there. If I was doing it today, like I might have just started my own thing and had it kind of have it be a niche, like, keep going back to the NBA Summer League, but like, the NBA Summer League players you have to watch and make that covering that better than a publication like an NBC or an ESPN that might not have time for something like that, kind of finding your niche and doing it on your own. But back then you had to kind of go through the gatekeepers. So it's really just kind of being persistent, sending out, multiple articles and really just trying to, again, go back to, selling them why that this content is going to be valuable to their readership.
Obviously, you spent a lot of time on before you went to college, but also college was a very formative experience for you in terms of your sports career. So what were some of the things you did in college and how did they formulate what you were doing to continue on the sports business career trajectory that you were on?
Yeah, it's funny. I spend so much of my time now working on podcasts, right? But when I was in college, I had never even heard of a podcast. It was such a nascent thing. So wasn't really spending a lot of time on that. But kind of the way I approached college, and I'm a proud, some would say obnoxious USC alum, was, hey, I've been doing this journalism thing for a while, since I was 11, 12, right? I think I've got that down. Let me try and get a different skill set to differentiate, diversify what I was doing. So I ended up being a business major and studying at the Marshall School of Business at USC, while still being very actively involved in the sports media community, but really trying to make sure that I understood the business and how the business of sports and the business of sports media worked, so that when I went back and did my, journalism, sports media, I could really kind of understand both sides of the coin. But, did a ton of internships, started, kind of going back to getting around the gatekeepers, started what became the number one most read USC basketball website. So kind of found that niche of, hey, everybody's covering the football team, but can I start this USC basketball website? And it kind of became a great outlet for, all of a sudden, instead of trying to get my own opportunities, I'm hiring other writers. And, some of those writers have gone on to work for Sports Illustrated and ESPN and Wall Street Journal. So kind of giving others that opportunity. But where kind of where I really got my foot in the door with NBC was, by then along the way, before I was interviewing the Magic Johnsons, I was interviewing a lot of Olympians and Paralympians and covering a lot of those events in the Los Angeles area. So I was able to go to NBC and say, hey, I've interviewed over 100 Olympians and Paralympians, got an internship at the London 2012 games, and have had some sort of peacock in my title for many, many years now.
You've covered or been involved with the Olympics ever since, which is really impressive. I want to talk about that in a second. But going back to hiring people when you're a college student, what was that like to hire people as a college student to cover the team, basically, and create some unique insights around the team? But B, you mentioned some of them have gone on to obviously write for Sports Illustrated and other outlets. Who are some of those people, and what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to shout out a couple, Max Meyer is one of my good friends and worked at NFL Network and Sports Illustrated. Paul Uggetti has become a big star at ESPN. I love seeing people like that have worked with succeed. But really kind of where that came from was, hey, like, I only have so much bandwidth to do this website myself. How can I kind of leverage others and open up the tent so that we can put together the best possible product? And really the goals back then are so different. The goal back then was, hey, the Pac-12 tournament is every year in Las Vegas. Can we make enough money during the basketball season to fund our trip to Vegas? And we would. I mean, we'd get, kind of a decent group of writers out there to Vegas just by doing things like using affiliate links to sell tickets, going to local bars and restaurants and selling sponsorships and things like that, so that I'm learning the skills of here's how to write for a website. Here's how to manage a staff for a website, and here's how to monetize it. So I really kind of understood every aspect of it. And, that's something I'm always telling my students, I'm sure you're telling your students too, is just, really try and learn the whole entire thing. Because if you can only do, you know, I think if I would have been born 10 years earlier, I would have been doing something completely different. I could have just written for the LA Times or just been on air or just done producing or done one thing. But those jobs don't exist as much. You really have to kind of understand everything and be able to wear a lot of different hats. And so just kind of understanding everything has been super helpful throughout my career.
I want to go into particularly the work that you started with the Olympics in 2012. But another good point that you brought up is that almost everything involves selling. Did selling come natural to you, or is it a learned or acquired skill? And if it is more of a learned or acquired skill, obviously putting yourself in position to sell, what have you found earlier in your career that was helped you to be successful? Obviously, you're still a kid, or relatively speaking, you're a young adult in college trying to sell a website that's hard work, sell sponsorship, at least make enough money to go to Las Vegas. So what did you learn about selling as part of your overall career development?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam. One formative internship I had in college was for Kathy Schlossman in the Los Angeles Sports and Entertainment Commission, where we were selling group sales for the 2012 NBA All-Star Game. So that kind of gave me that real like hands-on direct sales experience. But I'd say most of kind of the sales experience I've gotten has just been kind of more transferable skills of, practicing, pitching someone on something, trying to, explain why something should be done. So, I think almost everything I've done has involved some sort of salesmanship, even if it's not kind of directly like, certainly not selling ads or sponsorships for NBC, but you're definitely using a lot of those same skills on a daily basis. So it's something that, I think is really valuable for any, if you can sell, you can really do almost anything. So getting as much sales experience is always a good thing.
When I started my companies, one of the things, no, both the companies, way more sales experience and business development and marketing experience now with Roar, and now even as Roar has been acquired by Surge and working with Surge. But when I first started Block 6, selling didn't necessarily come as naturally to me, I think, as it came to you. So I'm always interested in when people are selling themselves or selling new products or selling offerings, what their sales experience is, because sales is really everything. You have to sell it. You're almost selling yourself all the time, particularly as an entrepreneur. And you obviously are an entrepreneur in two ways: one, a sports media entrepreneur, but also starting the website as an entrepreneur, and then pitching yourself to NBC as building your career from the start. So I'm always curious to see how people think about selling and if it's more natural to them or what they've learned, particularly earlier in their career, about selling and marketing and branding themselves.
And you get no's a lot, and it's just practice and figuring out what your pitch is. And I mean, it honestly, every aspect of life. I think anybody that knows me would say I outkicked my coverage with my wife, and convincing her to go out with me and eventually marry me. Shout out to Allie, who works at New York Roadrunners, my wife. That's sales. Everything's sales. So it's it's always about putting yourself out there and figuring out how you're different than everybody else.
Yeah, well, you got to use a sports metaphor and compliment your wife in the one sentence. That's always a good sign.
Hey,
Always
gotta
a
get
good
those brownie points.
indication of a good salesman. Yeah. Uh, so then you went to NBC. You mentioned you started with London. You started with an internship. So what did you do originally with NBC, particularly starting with coverage of the Olympics in 2012?
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I was so lucky because it's really shifted kind of the opportunities. For the internship, I was a logger, which means you're watching all of the moments and flagging when the big moments are, so they can use them for highlights and all that kind of stuff. Really, there was no reason to be in London itself during the Olympics for that. I mean, you could do that anywhere, right? And the kind of the unfortunate thing is those jobs aren't on location as much anymore. Like those are much more back home at HQ. But just kind of being on site, I was able to meet so many people that I still work with to this day, and all that. So just kind of taking it all in. I mean, when the thing with an Olympics is just that it's 17 days, right? And you're working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, and everybody's exhausted. But kind of the ones that succeed and kind of come out of it are the ones that are, even if you're there 16 hours, staying a couple more hours and just meeting people and not just being, head down on your computer, but actually like getting to know people and having a good attitude, not being like, oh, I'm so tired. When someone asks you how you're doing, like the worst thing you can do is say, oh, I'm so tired. Like everybody's tired, right? Like have something interesting to say, have something like, talk about a big moment that you watched, bond with that person, know if they have kids, know what's going on with them. And so, I think it was a great formative experience for me. And, I've met a ton of people I loved, and as evidenced by the fact that I'm still here. So they still haven't kicked me out yet. So
From London and obviously the logging experience to what did your career trajectory look like starting from there? Now you're in an interesting role with audio, and again, want to get into that, but how did you get to your role that you're in today, and what's your career journey been like at NBC?
yeah, so my first job out of school was with a station called Universal Sports Network, which was the year-round Olympic channel. Went through a bunch of different iterations. It became the Olympic channel after it was Universal Sports Network. But that was such a great formative experience for me because instead of starting at a NBC, starting at a smaller, still a national network, but a smaller network, I was able to wear a lot of different hats and do a lot more hands-on, not just kind of be as pigeonholed in one thing, which is, something I really do kind of try and encourage my students is like, it's great to start kind of at the biggest place, but you can really make a bigger impact at some place a little bit smaller and then come in to that bigger place at a higher level rather than kind of directly working yourself up. So started at Universal Sports Network for 2 years, moved over to NBC and was on the Olympic team for the Rio Olympics, the Pyeongchang Olympics. And kind of the way it works, especially at, a lot of places, but especially a place like NBC was you're on a contract. I got on a contract for the Rio Olympics and then was on a contract for the Winter Olympics. Was like, hey, I need to figure out how to do something that gets me off the contract, gets me in a full-time role, something that kind of is more promising and has more potential. So on the side, while I was still, kind of doing my full-time job, kind of just started pitching the idea to the execs of like, hey, like this is why we really need to start getting into audio. And this is why it's important. Just kind of focusing on what it needs to be. I think kind of the best, going back to the sales pitch that I had was not revenue, right? Because it's going to, no matter what we make, it's going to be a rounding error compared to that, primetime Olympic television spot that's being seen by 20 million people. So it's not the revenue as much of the reach and the marketing potential. So the way I sold it was you're at home, you're watching on television, you have NBC on your TV screen, right? You love watching it. So the next day you go to work and you're like, hey, I really need to know what happens in track and field. So while you're working, you pull up your desktop, you go to NBCOlympics.com and you're watching it on your computer. So you're covered at home, you're covered at work. Then all of a sudden you've got a doctor's appointment, you're waiting and you're like, oh my gosh, the 100-meter final is about to happen. Like, what am I going to do? You pull out your phone, you're able to watch on the app, right? So most of your day you're covered, but there's those hard to reach times where you just can't consume Olympic content. Think you're driving, you're at the gym, you're on a walk, you don't have great service, right? At those times, you can pop in a podcast, have it already downloaded, not have to worry about your connectivity, and you're able to consume that Olympic content. So now there's no part of your day where we can't reach you. And so that's kind of the way it worked. They kind of liked that pitch and just launched one podcast on the side, doing my other job, and that turned into 2 and 3. And, now I oversee, over 30 different shows, and it's kind of become more of a thing that I'm doing more full time instead of just on the side.
Couple things there. One, obviously, podcast is relatively a novel platform, even if obviously the idea of having a conversation is not novel. When you're talking about podcasts, you're talking about new, and you're obviously saying it's not as big a revenue generator as maybe a 30-second primetime ad, but there's still a cost associated. There's still time associated. It was obviously going to take your time and your energy and effort to make that happen for a relatively new medium. So you talk about selling it. You said, well, mostly it was like there were times that it wasn't covered, but how did you paint the picture of a new platform, a new audience, a new way of digesting content to executives who are used to a different way or a different type of content consumption than a podcast form?
Yeah, well, the revenue it's exploded just because
Right.
of doing
Yeah.
exactly what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And that's talking over video and having that video component.
Yeah.
You know, I think 5 years ago, all of our podcasts were audio only, right? So we had to rely just on a CPM of how many people were listening, how long they were listening, what we could sell for those ads. Now we're able to take that same conversation and without that much incremental work, chop it up a million different ways and fuel the whole multi-platform content ecosystem. So, let's say we're having this conversation, right? We could take the full conversation, put it on YouTube, put it on audio platforms, right? With a little bit of editing, we can put in ad breaks and make sure that it fit a 30-minute time slot for television. Then we could take a 2 or 3 minute clip, put it on the website. We could take 30 seconds of it and put it on social media. And all of a sudden the revenue is so diversified. We're fueling all of our different platforms. And so you've got this increase of revenue, but also this decrease of cost, because in the olden days, you would have had to have a studio show, have a lighting guy, camera guy, all the different kind of components that went into that. And that was just television. Now we're putting it in a million different places, saving money, generating money. So it's really, it tells a great story of just what you can, accomplish in that way.
Did you anticipate this when you first launched, that there would be a video element to it? Because to me, it's still just surprising that I get the audio element. Obviously, we're having a conversation. But did you think when you first pitched this idea that there would be video element and all these ways to chop up the content in the ways you described?
No, I didn't, honestly. And the lines have become so blurred. And,
Yeah.
that's something, I was on the board of the Podcast Academy, which is the industry's largest professional membership organization. And I think there's always this kind of trepidation of like, hey, is it still a podcast if there's video? Is this, what is a podcast? And it's funny, I'll tell you, like, I've almost, I kind of metaphorically have a swear jar on my desk, and I try never to use the word podcast, because when people hear podcast, they think of something that's coming in their ears. But really, this is kind of a multi-platform experience. And I think the reason it works, to give you an analogy, if you were to take a radio play-by-play call and add video to it, it would sound really good. It would look really good, right? Because there's somebody always talking, and then you just kind of cover it with some video and it works. Versus if you go the other way and you take the television play-by-play and try and strip out the audio, there's going to be a lot of pauses. They're going to be referencing something that is being shown on the camera. It doesn't really work. So it's just kind of a natural medium. If we can take this quote unquote audio podcast and add video to it, it paints a much better picture than if we just try and strip the audio from a video product. So going in that direction has been made a lot of sense. But yeah, we do kind of chuckle to ourselves that we kind of ended up back where we started. We launched these podcasts, as a complement to our video product. And now it's kind of, replacing or, adding on to our video product. So we the lines are definitely kind of blurred and it goes back and forth.
You don't have to say exact numbers, but on a relative basis, what does the revenue look like now that there are all these video components in addition to the audio components? And how has that impacted what you're thinking about from a video CPM versus an audio CPM basis?
I don't want to give exact numbers, but it is, I think it's probably I can't imagine what would be a faster growing part of our P&L than the audio business. And, it's not easy to quantify, because if we put a 30-minute podcast on television, it can't just count the revenue against that. It's got to be the incremental revenue over if we put some other programming. So you have to kind of factor in the opportunity cost. So it is tough to put exact numbers on it, but it's definitely, one of, if not the fastest parts of our P&L and something that, the revenue is only going up and the costs are really kind of flat, if not going down.
You mentioned 30 different podcasts. You obviously talked a lot about your Olympics, and that was the original conceit. So what are some of the 30 different podcasts? And are there ones that are more or less popular, probably more popular than you thought when you originally launched the podcast?
It's a great question. I think that two things I really consider when launching a new show is what the audience is and what we can sell. So starting with the selling part, we really try and align it with our programming strategy, what we're showing on television, because we're already out in the market selling that. If we have to go kind of sell this unique product, the sales team just doesn't have the bandwidth to do it. So trying to kind of align with our sales product, to give you an example, NBC Sports Bay Area, our RSN in the Bay Area, televises the Golden State Warriors. If we have a Warriors podcast, can we upsell the Warriors television partners by making them the presenting sponsor of the podcast? That's been a really successful strategy to kind of bundle it in. And number two is going back to it is the audience. I think when we started this, we thought like, hey, let's take our highest profile talent and launch shows around them. And almost without exception, that never really worked because you're not a fan. You like the talent, but you're not a fan of the talent. You watch them when they're on television, but you're not actively seeking out their content. And if we've got high profile talent that's going from Olympics to Kentucky Derby to NFL, it's like, what is that? Versus if we can really super serve and go on a beat and have something, follow a team, whatever it is, a league, a sport, go really deep on that and super serve the fan, you'll listen to that because if you're a fan of that specific team or whatever it is. So that's always the thing, because I get a ton of pitches kind of coming my way. And it's like, I want to start a podcast. It's like, great, but what are you going to talk about and who is seeking out that content, not just, turning on the mic and just kind of having, just going from topic to topic because people aren't going to be seeking that out.
What data do you use to see if people are actively seeking out that content? Obviously, the Golden State Warriors are fans of the Warriors and obviously Steph Curry and the team, and they've done a great job of becoming a global brand. But outside of specific teams, what kind of data are you looking at to see if people are interested in the content? 'Cause that's a really interesting point about not following the talent, but more focused on what the content is. So how do you make the determination there's a large audience for the content that will be on the podcast?
The great news on that, Adam, is we have like an embarrassment of riches of so much data because we have, hey, what have people been watching on our television stations? What have people been reading on our website? What have people been consuming on our social media platforms? And when we see that there's, a certain interest in something that we're talking about on other platforms, it's likely going to kind of correlate into the podcast multi-platform audio space. So really kind of just trying to see where there's a niche and then how we can differentiate ourselves and provide the best possible product because, there's a lot of Warriors podcasts, right? But can we have the best talent that has either gets the best interviews or has the best analysis or differentiates it by only talking about analytics or something that's different than is out there? Like, what is our lane? Because you can't just say, hey, the Warriors are really popular. Let's launch a Warriors podcast because there's all this competition. So why is ours different? Why is ours better? Why will people flock to ours?
Do you see, and I'm genuinely interested, obviously they're somewhat self-serving by asking this question, but do you see a lot of interest in analytics or the business of sports? Are you seeing that as a viable content for mass consumption? Or do you see, I guess for lack of a better term, do you see a large enough audience and things that people used to consider relatively niche subject matters like analytics or the business of sports?
It's a great question because, you and I are both, sports business nerds, judging the awards, like I'm starstruck by Abe Madcorn, so for me, that's something that's personally of interest to me, from a business perspective, worked with the CNBC team, Alex Sherman, to help launch the CNBC Sport podcast because we were really excited about the potential there within the sports business realm. That show is doing really well. We obviously, we being NBC Universal, spun off CNBC into what's now Versant. So don't work as much with them on the day to day. And we haven't found that kind of, someone like an expert that like an Alex to kind of stand up a sports business show. So it's not something we cover heavily right now as much as we did when we had CNBC, but it's definitely something I'm a fan of and interested in doing. So it's, it's on my notepad of things I'm looking at.
I think sports business analytics, obviously intersections of what we're both interested in. It is surprising how many people are interested in that. We've been approached about, can we expand the podcast out? This is not a pitch to you about for the Roar podcast to do it on NBC, but it is interesting the audience that is out there for what I would have historically thought is relatively niche content. And clearly there is a demand for long form, what used to be considered a relatively narrow space. I think that's really interesting that there's an audience and that's something you guys explored. It's a really good point about CNBC. Obviously, Sports Business Journal has spun out a bunch of podcasts on their side as well. One of the things I also wanted to talk to you about, given where you sit, beyond the niche and content is technology and some of the disruptions that may be happening from artificial intelligence impacting content more generally. From your perspective and where you sit as somebody who's thinking about content and how content can be distributed all the time, how do you anticipate AI or changes in video and audio production? How does that impact what you're thinking about on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's something I think about daily, and it's, kind of breaking the fourth wall here. You and I are talking on Riverside here, which, for your audience, is kind of, I would just describe as a much more sophisticated version of Zoom. And, this is, I don't want this to sound like an ad for Riverside, but we use Riverside and it's amazing. It's got this technology that instantly we're done with this recording. It will transcribe everything we say at a, pretty good level. It'll, it's very, very accurate on transcribing, which saves us a ton of time. But kind of more impressive than that is it will know what the best sound bites are and will suggest like, hey, we think that this is a really good sound bite. You should consider posting this on social, and it'll cut that sound bite for you, which is, I honestly don't know how it does it, but it is pretty accurate. Like, I don't know if it's based on reaction. I know, we use WSC a lot for which is, kind of a similar thing for clipping highlights. And I think they do it based on like the roar of the crowd to be able to know which are the best highlights. But it's, amazing technology where it's not kind of that, AI just gets conflated in so many ways of like the content creation AI is one thing, but the kind of efficiency and the tools that you can leverage using AI to do something like transcribing, figuring out what clips to cut, and then you have that human element of, okay, is this really a good clip? How can we sell it with copy? There's always going to be that kind of human component of it, but it kind of frees up our humans to do more things if we can kind of leverage the power of AI.
What are some of the things that's something we're asked about a lot too at Roar is like, what are some of the things that humans have been freed up to do now that you have these? I totally agree with you. We love Riverside. It's been really helpful for us in terms of producing the podcast, but what are the humans and your team able to do that they weren't able to do?
A great example of that WSC is highlight cutting is something that a basic editor can do, right? I mean, you kind of go, we're watching the World Cup right now. You know that when Messi scores a goal, you want to have an in and out of Messi scoring that goal. AI can do that, right? But what AI can't do is have more sophisticated storytelling, do something that's much more creative. So if we can have our editors spending less time on just doing the simple in-out editing, we can have them do the more sophisticated, creative, out-of-the-box storytelling. So that's what everybody kind of gets into the business to do, is they want to do stuff that's fun, out of the box, tell stories, not just, clipping in and out highlights. So if we can kind of free up their time from doing that and give them the freedom to stretch their creative muscles, it's a win-win for everybody.
Is that something that you think, even from a content creation perspective, more heavily focused on narrative storytelling? AI can make content creation easier, can make it better, doesn't always make it better. But from your perspective, is that where you see the future of this medium moving towards, is more creative narrative storytelling or expertise in specific areas? Or where do you guys see content creation from where you're sitting going from, given the rise in technology platform?
I think exactly. It's, a lot of content creation has kind of become commoditized. Like, used to have an AP writer at every single game. And now you've got using box scores, putting out that gamer through AI. So, if that's not where the entry level jobs were, 20 years ago, it's, hey, can you go to that game and tell an interesting story? Or can you see something that's not in the box score? What can you do to add value and kind of give you a reason to be at that game? When the kind of low hanging fruit of who scored the most points and, who did this and that is already kind of taken care of. So, I think that's super important for both of our students is what can you do that AI can't do, and how can you add value in that way?
You mentioned students a few times, and I want to end on that part. Like, obviously, are teaching now. Where are you teaching? What are you teaching? What's been the most interesting elements of teaching? We obviously are both professors, and a lot of our colleagues and peers are interested in teaching. And what is that process and experience like? Particularly given some of the work that you're doing at NBC, but also some of the stuff that you're teaching. Why did you decide to teach, and what's that experience been like teaching?
I gotta tell you, Adam, it's one of the most fun things I get to do. So the course I teach is called Multi-Platform Olympic and Paralympic Storytelling, and I do it at USC. And you're probably asking yourself, hey, why am I talking to you on the East Coast when you're teaching at USC? The answer is I teach the class just in the fall. I do half the classes in person and half remotely from out here on the East Coast. So gives me an excuse to go back in the fall for some football games and to see my family in Los Angeles. But, what we really try and do is prepare these students to be able to do, everything that you and I have talked about, be multi-platform storytellers, understand the unique dynamics that are involved with an Olympic and a Paralympics, because so many classes are through the lens of American football, soccer, baseball, basketball. We exclusively talk about the Olympics and Paralympics. And, kind of the reason I signed up to do it is, I don't think I would just, teach a random class out here in New York, but it's because the class is in Los Angeles with the LA 28 Olympics and Paralympics coming up. It felt like it was the right place, the right time, the right opportunity. We're able to tell our students and our guest speakers, literally the seat that you're sitting in the classroom, you could be sitting in 2 years as somebody that's working as a member of the media or working for the organizing committee or whatever it is during LA 28, because they're going to take over the Annenberg building that we're in. So it's been really rewarding for me to do that. And, selfishly, it helps me kind of stay at the forefront of what's happening next, because the way that my students are consuming content, consuming technology is much different than the way I did it. And it's just, it's really special. We just had another student hired here full time. Shout out to Anthony Bettino. He and Jack Hallinan, two of my former students, were getting lunch tomorrow, actually. So it's pretty cool to see, students that, have been through my class, now just bumping them in the hallways here at NBC and kind of, seeing them succeed, gives me kind of great joy just to watch them be here crushing it and doing that and paying forward, as so many people, helped me along the way. So it's fun to give back.
Last question, and this is something I just find interesting in my own classes. I think there's a common wisdom or commonly held perception that younger demographics are consuming more multimodal content consumption in shorter form content. Obviously, with podcasts, that's longer form content. Do you see students actually consuming the content in multi-form? Do you see it more in social short form, or what is their content consumption? What have you learned about their content consumption by teaching the class?
No, it's a great question, Adam. And it's exactly that. I mean, it's really taught me, hey, rather than trying to paddle upstream, let's fish where the fish are. Let's figure out, hey, how can we think social first when we're putting out our shows so that we really get somebody hooked, and that, rather than, trying to do it the other way around where you try and pull out the best soundbite from the interview, thinking, hey, can we structure a segment that would work really well on social? Can we present something in a different way? Does our show really need to be that long? I think, even just from this is my fourth year doing it, just changing the assignments I'm giving to kind of better reflect what they want to do, what they're good at. And then, in the workplace, hey, how can we change our content to, I think about that all the time. Would my students be interested in this content? How can I position it differently so that it would get the attention of my students? Because, I mean, they know just as much about sports as, our parents' generation did, but they're watching a heck of a lot less games. They're just consuming it in other ways. And so it's just about, hey, how can you reach them? How can you get them excited about whatever it is you're doing?
It's an interesting place to end it. Maybe I'll have you back on to discuss that in more detail. But Seth, it's great to have you on. Great to learn about everything that you're doing at NBC. Still a relatively novel form in terms of the combination of audio and video content. Thanks for being a guest on the Roar podcast.
No, it's an honor, Adam. My brother is a MBA JD graduate of Northwestern. A lot of my mentors went to Northwestern, and so I feel like an honorary Wildcat. So it's an honor to be on this show.
As we always say, flattery will get you everywhere. So thank you again for being on the show.
Of course, you got it, Adam. Thank you.